Okay, welcome along to Tru Thoughts on Zoom. I'm Robert Louis, and I've got joined by special guest DJ Fingers, aka Carl, from the legendary group The Sindecut. Hello, Carl.
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, not bad. I'm good. We were having a little chat beforehand, just doing a little plan that we're not really going to plan to do anything on this thing. So I'm just going to have a little chat with you, Carl, just about the history of you as a producer, a DJ, an artist, and also we're going to get into it not in too much detail this time, but a little bit because we've signed the Sindecut and DJ to Tru Thoughts, and we've got a brilliant album from you forthcoming, which we're really looking forward to releasing. But for me, if anybody doesn't know, I'm a huge Sindecut fan, and I play your tunes. I think there's never been a year I haven't played your records on the radio or out in the DJ sets, you know, ever since I first heard your music in the sort of mid to late 80s. So I guess for anybody, I think what we'll do is we'll just ask a little bit about, you know, where the group started. And your first release was 1987, was it, or 88?
Yeah, as a Sindecut, that was the first release. Yeah. So, at that time, it was Crazy Noddy and myself when we founded the group. I met Noddy in a place that was called Spats. That was like the early HipHop community in London. And generally, at that time, say around '84, the HipHop community was more breakdance orientated and body popping. So there was a club that was in Tottenham Court Road, end of Oxford Street, I think around 34 to 36 Oxford Street. Westwood had put this on every Saturday lunchtime. And I grew up in Tottenham, and when I left school and went to YTS, I knew about Spats, but I was like into the DJing and the breakdance thing. A lot of my friends, some of my friends in school, they were into martial arts, and then they got into breakdancing. So for me, I considered them like the top range breakers, definitely in London. But so I didn't follow them to Covent or places that they went. I just stayed at home and practiced and was doing my thing. But to cut a long story, a guy who was in a group, Mark Anderson, who's in a group called Breakazoids, who were like they were a known group, but they were always touring. Around the time Flashdance happened, they started touring abroad with some of the Flashdance breakdancers. I couldn't name who they were, but when they came back from tour, they heard about me from being local in Tottenham, and they introduced me to Westwood at Spats. And then when I went there, I saw Family Quest and has the original rap group, and Capital Boys, Junior G, Sergeant Rock, and Westwood took a like to me. We were called Mix Masters. Me and my best friend in school, I called him Braxton. Call him Perm Braxton now. Ironically, we were born on the same day, like hours apart. And we both were into the same thing, into the mixing, and then we got into the scratching.
How old were you then?
At that age, I'd already left school. So by the time we went to Spats for the first time and got introduced to everyone, I stayed on a year in school in the sixth form to retake my CSEs. So technically, that would have been '84. So I think I would have been
17?
Maybe 17 or something like that. 17, nearly 18, because I'm a Pisces. I'm a March born. So yeah, technically it's all funny. Like I've got good long-term memory, but that question, I've never really thought about the age I was. But
so you had turntables at that time as well.
What was funny was like when I was in school, and I would have been 16 or even 15, I had like just my parents' turntable. That was like this turntable that had a cassette deck on the side, and you could put loads of records on top of each other, and it had this button that you can switch from phono to the cassette or back to the phono. So I used that as a sort of as a way to cut and just put a bit of paper on the spin. You know them old turntables where you could put maybe stack the records. So like I took that record player to Braxton's house because we realized when we were like in the fourth year, which would have been, you know, when you choose your subjects and you're doing your mock exams, around that time, the time when should have got serious, that's when I really just like focused on, we used to do pause mixes. And then I realized that this guy, Braxton, in school, he was doing the same thing. And then we already knew that we were born on the same day because there was two other people that we knew. But because we knew that we were doing the same thing, pause button mixes, you just lift up the needle and play a record, and then you just record a little bit, and then you pull it back. And we were doing stuff like that, and we were doing some really intricate stuff, and then overdubbing and fading. So, you know, I'd say we were around 14, 15 when we were doing that. And then because we both realized the skills that we had doing that, we kind of got into the DJing. And in our school, it's funny that we've gone off on a tangent. I'm telling you, but yeah, in our school, if you didn't like I went to school in White Hart Lane called the Somerset School, which was like a very old school. It doesn't exist now. It's kind of controversial because it's like one of the oldest schools easily in England. The Duchess of Somerset set it up for poor people, maybe in the 16th, 17th century. And we went to that school, which was on White Hart Lane, but White Hart Lane is quite a long road. So even though it's Tottenham, like you'd think of Tottenham, White Hart Lane, it's a bit of a stretch away. And in that school, it was very mixed. We had like Asian, Pakistani, Turkish, Cypriot, Greek, and obviously English, and a few it was beginning a few like Yugoslavian or Hungarian friends. And what we noticed is like our group, we were like we wasn't generally like we liked reggae. It was like we just liked good music. So people they kind of labeled you're either jazz funk or you're into reggae. And some of the younger kids, because by that time we were like in the fifth year, sixth form, fifth form, you know, they were more like the younger ones would more say like, oh, you guys are soft because you're not into the music that maybe they had older brothers and their parents were probably a bit younger than my parents. But because we found that we all liked the group, like it's like this guy Braxton, we found that we liked the same music. We all there was a group of us in our year that we all realized, oh, we all listened to the same radio shows at the weekend. And then these were the type of records that we would be like doing pause mixes with. And then with that turntable, at one stage, a guy that I've spoke to you about before, Adrian Wong, I think his nickname was Wu-Tang in the industry. He left school. He was part of us. We called ourselves the Mix Masters, and he was part of us. I think in school we originally called ourselves the Cutting Wizards. You know, we had that influence from WizKid, and but he showed us how we could calculate, because I'm terrible at maths, even though my brother's like a maths genius. We found he taught us how to calculate the BPM of the records just by with this little counter he had, and he said times it by 60 or something like that, count it for 30 seconds and times it by, and then we realized the records we had, it could be really eclectic, like I don't know, Reach Up, Tony Lee, to obviously all the early Sam records, West End records, you know, things like just off the top of my head, like I loved Prelude, like Sharon Red, things like that. And then it could be even though everyone said that stuff was, you were into jazz funk, I mean, a lot of the stuff we were listening to on the pirate radio wasn't necessarily jazz funk. It could have been like Electro, or you realize later that there were jazz musicians that were doing different alternative type of records, you know, Tom Brown and Tyrone Bronson, you know, and obviously
Herbie Hancock, Rocket, isn't it?
So, yeah, obviously Herbie Hancock, and there was others. You learn Ntombe. You learn later on, like, oh, these guys, they've got either their jazz or their parents were jazz artists. But yeah, what I would do, I lived like behind on Tottenham High Road, more further to where the McDonald's is, the heart of Tottenham, in the back, and Braxton lived at the other end of White Hart Lane. So I used to carry my turntable, parents' turntable, to his house, and would set them up. And we realised that his turntable was 3 BPM faster than my turntable in a weird way. It's kind of weird. So we made a little book, and we wrote down all the different tempos on what turntable, and then we'd work out how we could actually start mixing records. And that was that would have been like 80, before Wildstar, because Wildstar arguably is like 83 when it was released.
Yeah,
So
exactly,
I'd
yeah.
say like before Wildstar that year, we were starting to mix records. And then when Wildstar came out, we kind of more got into, we kind of realized that's what we want to be. We want to be the MC, DJ for the MC. We kind of wanted to get into more of that, and then we started looking at doubles and things like that. But the other thing was, in a weird way, like one of my friends who was a big breakdancer, Richard, he they all went to see Wildstar because Wildstar was there. You know, like I said, the culture was more dance orientated. They came and knocked on our door, my family door, and said to me, like, you know that you're part of this culture that is called, you know, that they called hip hop. And they said, yeah, we saw kind of what you kind of do in Wildstar. And then that kind of was the beginning of what brought us into an understanding, like there's this bigger culture. Because we kind of, I was more seduced in the early days of creativity by like Kiss FM in America, because I don't know if you heard of a sax trumpeter called Byron Wallen.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Byron lived opposite me, literally on the street I lived on. When you see Bad Meaning Good, the window that you see in there, I could look out there and Byron's literally across the road. So the first band I was in actually was with Byron around that time. And Byron was more a keyboardist, but he was practicing the trumpet, and he went to the States every year. I think maybe, I'm not sure if it's fair to say, but I'm sure he told me at some stage he was studying with Donald Byrd, but he always went to New York every summer. And one day coming home from school, because he was a few years younger, I saw him doing the moonwalk, and I was like, hey, how did you learn that? And then we became more friends. Even though he lived opposite, we didn't really speak, but we used to walk to school together and come home. And then I used to ask him, when you go to the States in the summer, just put a cassette in and record Kiss FM radio for me. So
So,
maybe once or twice. Sorry.
so in a world, I mean, it's obviously pre-internet world. I mean, for me,
100%. Yeah.
yeah, for
Yeah.
me, it's very much reminding me of my age where I was listening to pirate radio. And you're in Tottenham. When I first came to the UK, we lived in Walthamstow. Then we moved to South Woodford, and my mum
Okay.
worked in
Wow.
Tottenham. And my mum
Yeah.
worked in Tottenham. So I
Right.
remember, I think it was my 12th birthday, and I asked her, I saw someone breakdancing outside Woolworths. And I don't know how,
Yeah.
I think because of the Street Sounds compilation, B-Boys 2-3 Break. And my mum went, I asked her
Yes.
to get me the B-Boys
Yeah.
2-3 Break. And that was one of the first
Wow.
records I ever got on
Oh,
12th. I think I was
that's
12 or
amazing.
13, yeah, so around
Wow.
that time. But
That's
you were very
amazing.
much trying to discover. You didn't really,
Yeah.
and it wasn't. I've been reading a book recently, and as I recall, it wasn't firmly everything was definitely called hip hop. It was a little
No,
bit
it was like
fluid,
electro.
wasn't it?
It
Yeah.
was like electro, like and even the electro tag. I mean, like when I think about it's hard to imagine what we played at Spats, because in the beginning it was something Westwood did, and then he took a liking to what me and Braxton were doing as mix masters, because everything was like breakdance crews. So there was a crew called Imperial Mixers that were Cutmaster Swift was part of that group, but we looked at him at that time as like a breakdancer, but he was part of Imperial Mixers, and Imperial Mixer was the first DJ that had the platform as a DJ in the UK, in London, as or like Westwood platformed on the radio, and we were like, not really sure about what Imperial. I love Imperial. I haven't seen him for a long time, but I used to think I didn't really hear anything that like we knew DST. Uh, he was emulating what DST did, and that what kind of what gave me my break. Like Wiz from the Breakers was saying to me, "Oh, do you think you're better than Imperial?" And I'm like, "Yeah, we've got our own thing. Definitely, we could stand up to it." So he brought us down as the mix masters, but at that time there was another crew. This is like 84. There was another crew called the Deck Masters, which I can remember, but people might listen and think, well, there was this crew or that crew, but at the time the DJs were in groups. Like I said, Swift was in a group called Imperial Mixers, but he had the guy called Imperial Mixer, and then Swift was like breakdancing, but he had great potential as a scratch DJ. And at Spats, you'd meet everybody that we knew. Swift was we were kind of like, yeah. At that time, it was kind of funny because we were young as well. We weren't completely smart. We were like, you can't do both. You can't be like this and that. And then in the end, he I'm not sure if he continued the breaking thing, but yeah, he definitely, he became who he is. Yeah.
So you were doing. So I guess was this before the Street Sounds Electro compilations, because to me that seems to be at that age where I remember it just blowing my mind hearing the records mixed together.
Maybe I'm not being 100% clear because I'm jumping from ages like the like Street Sounds from my memory, like Morgan Calm could be releasing like Street Sounds albums that were like funk, jazz, funk. A lot of soul.
That's what was going on before, wasn't it?
All the classic records you'd hear on pirate stations, he was playing, and then the phenomenon of Electro. By the time Wild Style came out, I'm sure we already had Buffalo Girls, and Hey You the Rocksteady Crew. I'm sure we already had this stuff out, but the Electro series, definitely that first one, that was what kept me and Braxton, Wizzy D, mix masters. That kept us in my house or his house because he had my turntable there. And then, to answer your question quickly, we when we knew we really needed better turntables, I begged and begged my mum, like that Bart Simpson episode, just kept on nagging her all day, always nagging her. And then we broke it down to her, and she eventually did a higher purchase. And we weren't a rich family, but we broke down how collectively it was three of us that we would pay for these turntables. And by the time we kept them in Braxton's house, and by the time we got to Spats and met Westwood, and then everything started to build from there. We already were like definitely knew that we were more into the cutting and scratching more than the mixing. More by then. Yeah.
And paid off the turntables as well.
No, I mean, like, eventually we did. Yeah, I don't even know if I don't. Yeah, I tried to forget about that. I'm sure I wasn't that honourable with my mother with payments. Yeah,
they give this. I know with mum because I was 14. I think I'd been pestering my mum, and then my mum told me if I do my studies and get to university. So she worked on a long
brilliant,
presents for Christmas sort of thing. And then when she bought 2 SoundLab turntables, and I'd saved up and bought my mixer, and I went to uni.
Brilliant.
With that having not great turntables, but at least going to. But my mum played a long-term game. Shout out to all the mums there helping that.
100%. A lot of, I think at that time, even some guys that I can remember, they all got into getting turntables. They never got Techniques, but I think they all had Panasonic or these belt drive ones.
Yeah, I had SoundLab.
You try them on that. You try them, and you like not quite like even just for the mixing. But I I think we were more than ready for the techniques when we had got them. We'd cut our teeth on.
And it's a very different era. I mean, there is almost quite a barrier to entry because, in relatively speaking, all this equipment was a lot of money. And I guess with something, if you're talking about hip hop and a career in the music industry, because all barriers were shut, it's a very different era now. It just seemed like a faraway dream. Whereas hip hop, I guess for our generation, was probably a thing that just was an actual spark to say, well, actually, these people are, someone's spending a load of money recording an amazing drum, and someone who lives in projects in New York and then going to sample it and then making a record. So it was. But
it's funny what you're saying, though.
World,
it's funny. It's funny because I always think this, like I went to uni like quite late. I wanted to go from the time we came off Virgin, but I had other responsibilities. And around 2000, about 20 years ago, I think I started my journey back academically. And I'd meet people that were younger, and I would say to them that at the time, like, we didn't have this word called sampling. Like, say, like 80, 83, 80, 84, even if the technology was there, it's like, even though, like, as quick as I met Family Quest, we went into a studio and made a recording. It was kind of like the drum machine, and maybe there was bits of musicianship, but my take on it, I can only speak for myself, is like the sampling thing. For me, is emulating what I was doing on the turntables, and that was my transition into that. And even some of the early records we made, we didn't even, like the Eddie Richards stuff, we didn't even really sample. It was like a tape loop. We might do a tape loop because we didn't have the memory.
So that brings us onto that first. So that's Eddie Richards. So that was your first release, is that right?
It has the Sindecut. Yeah, I was fortunate that as quick as we kind of got into this scene, that the guys who were dancing were telling me, like, yeah, we're in this culture. When I went to Spats, as soon as I met Family Quest in Spats, I knew these were the guys I'd love to DJ, because there was a big impact with seeing Wild Style and seeing the MCs with the DJs, and then knowing that, like, people around us in the community, they were more into the reggae sound system culture, so you could see the similarity, but that I was more seduced by the fact of the two turntables and the MC. So when I saw, of all the MCs I saw at Spats, like, they might just do a little guest spot when Westwood played some records, and the Family Quest, you had Jive Jr., Sergeant Rock, Dizzy Heights, occasionally Capital Boys, but I fell in love with Family Quest, and it was reciprocal. They loved what me and Michael was doing, like, as mix masters, and we were inseparable from the day that we met them at Spats. Saturday lunchtime finishes at 3. We didn't. We were always together, and I think the fortunate thing, like you said, you lived in Walthamstow. What made it even more fortunate for me was that Family Quest lived in Holloway Road, so we would travel together. And Dirty Harry, he lived not far from Michael Sobel's, so I could get a bus. I'd take my turntables. One of Linny Lynn's younger brother, Rodney, Linny Lynn, the MC in Sindecut, his younger brother used to follow me first, like, and he'd help carry one of the turntables, and all I had to do is get to Harry's house, and then we would get the Piccadilly line straight to Tottenham Court Road from his house every Saturday morning. But I think that's what helped me have a really good friendship with them, and become part of them. So I cut my teeth with the Quest at that time, yeah.
And it's I think it's a really important thing. I think that's why I'm such a fan of what you have done as a Sindecut. We do need to remind ourselves it's the story of course, there's the hip-hop cultural story of the world, but there's very much what was going on in the UK, and you were quite early in the turntable part, and I think as you're explaining, your influence is coming almost from those Kiss FM UK USA
Yeah,
mixes that were going there. I
yeah.
remember hearing those on pirate
I
stations.
didn't know how they were doing it.
Yeah.
I thought because at that time we didn't have turntables. It was just like the tape recorder. So I didn't understand even things like Latin Rascals with the reel to reel. I think we did. Me and Braxton did get a reel to reel eventually. We started doing 4-track stuff, but I think in the beginning we didn't understand the depths of how Shep Pettibone and Francois Kevorkian, some of these people who were doing the mixes that were played on Kiss that we would hear. And then some records that you'd buy, like the Prelude records that had the mixes. So like, I love D-Train. D-Train, an album like D-Train, it was like every track on the album. I loved the first album with You're the One for Me, you know, tracks like Walk On By and all that. And when I heard that album, was just like blown away by and then when Byron would go to New York and he'd come back, he might bring a cassette and it would have an alternative like mix of it, but which is kind of like an edit. And that these little things, Sharon Red, all these little things before the records came out that they'd released, was hearing these little they'd have these little spots where they'd have these little mixes, and that had a big impact on me, definitely.
And in the foundation of what's gone on in the UK, and I think it's really important because obviously, look, with the Wild Bunch and their Massive Attack and Soul to Soul, obviously because of their huge success, that story is very well told, and they're being told in the early. But I always look at what you were doing, because it was very early that this was going on, and you were releasing music in sort of 88, and I think also, I mean, we'll get onto it, but signing to Virgin and what you doing with almost the soul music, you were pushing boundaries as much as Soul to Soul and Massive Attack were in my mind. And I think I remember at the scene at that time, everybody was almost playing all of, you know, if they were playing Soul to Soul, they were also playing your records. But I think historically, which often happens because of their success, you get written out a little bit when, you know, sometimes the more mainstream articles are written. But I very much think you because of sonically and production wise what you were doing, you know, you were pushing the boundaries. But these foundations are just absolutely fascinating. So with the Sindecut track, so how do you get into the studio? You know, what was the catalyst to get into the studio?
Like when I left school, I used to, when I left school, and then I already kind of was doing spats and then doing lots of things for Family Quest. Like if they weren't doing like what I'd call like a PA performance of records that they had made, I was always doing the house parties and the youth centres, and I might even bunk off going to a youth training scheme and go with them. And I was comfortable having money, and even had a group of friends. I'd always be feeding them, and I was comfortable like at home. And then I always, from the time of Spat, so as early as '85. After I made the first guested on the record, me and Braxton, we cut up, we scratched in the record, Dancing Out of Space. So you hear them shout mix masters and all the scratching we had done on that. And I realized at that point that going forward with Family Quest, other than doing like the underground stuff and parties, I wasn't going to get a break producing or getting into the production, because they had a sort of a place that was like a youth, they were very much involved with youth community stuff, Family Quest. And I only found this out recently, but Emix's father, a place called Caxton House, he used to run that, and Emix used to work there. So even when we were doing spats, Emix will be telling me about a jam they had every Friday night before Saturday lunchtime, in Archway called High Tech, and Soul to Soul would be there.
Oh, right.
And I think through that, maybe Wild Bunch. So like Freshkey, who's like, I don't know if you remember a group called Mo Rock and Freshkey. They're from Islington, Tufnell Park area, but Freshkey's like one of the first MCs in this country, and he's sort of not written out, but he sort of like, I could have been a DJ with him, but because I met him before I knew anybody even Family Quest, I didn't know, but he already had a DJ called Mo Rock, who we became good friends. But Freshkey, he I'm trying to forget now why I mentioned Freshkey, why I mentioned him. But yeah, sorry, just going off on a tangent, but
no,
it
that's
will
all right.
come back.
Yeah.
Apologies.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So what was the? How did you end up with getting into the studio then for the first?
Yeah, so like what I was doing was like the money. I didn't have money, but I had friends that I had met in Tottenham that were a little bit younger, and they would be saying to me, "Do you sign on?" Because I was just happy at home. I know at the weekend I'd go and do spats, and sometimes I'm running around with Family Quest, and I do little youth club things, and I was trying to do little promotions in the area. We had a few clubs in the Northumberland Park, which wasn't just a stone's throw from Tottenham Stadium. They had like a little amphitheatre, and a youth worker there was allowing me to do jams. So I was beginning to do jams outside of spats, and because one of my friends said to me, "How come you don't sign on? You can sign on," because I was kind of proud to do that at the time. So what I did was like I'd get the money from signing on, which probably is not much less than what people probably get now. It would be like maybe I was getting like 70 every 2 weeks, and I'd use that money and I'd just go into a recording studio. Oh, right. I'd find a studio. Sometimes I'd venture down to a studio and look at it, and then I'd speak to the owner and I'd say, "Look, can I have it in the nighttime?" I don't know how I knew that if you just got the studio in the nighttime, you could do a better deal. And the engineer that I worked with, they'd never done this type of music. They were mostly doing live music, mostly maybe I'd say rock at the time. They would try to allow me to do what I was trying to do, but I was always like taking an idea, because I said because of Family Quest showing me that maybe I wouldn't get as much of a break as I wanted with them in the studio, that it pushed me to more do what I wanted to do, what I always wanted to do.
So you're probably trying to make a song at that point, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I was making demos at home. I used to take the dough money and I'd hire a 4-track, hire a sound processor, drum machine, and I'd always, make ideas and maybe give it to Westwood. He'd play it on the radio. And like I was saying to you, like Undercover was probably at that time was another DJ that it was from South London that was probably getting a platform on Westwood, early mixes on Westwood.
Yeah, I remember Undercover on Westwood.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, all of these. Yeah. That's what I remember hearing those mixes, and I record. Look, I can't remember. I recorded a few things, but you sort of think I only had 2 blank cassettes, so I always recorded a show and had to put my hair out. So I've only got a few, still.
I'd be a bit naughty and maybe take the cassette from my dad might have a cassette or something and take it and then record it. And then some of the early cassettes, the karma came back to me, because some of the early stuff that I used to give to like Linny Lynn or they would record over it. So I'm like, well, that's what happens, isn't it? With the cassettes, they might hear like listen to Dave Pearce or something and say, "Oh, I just recorded over this," Yeah, but it is what it is.
So you were getting to a point of sort of recording the demos then, and then so did you approach that label or did they approach you?
No, what was weird was like there was a few, like Cool Cash C was an early MC, like Electro Rock. You see him next to Sipo in the dressing rooms, and he's rapping. Someone's banging on the desk. He weirdly lived in Tottenham. He was from Hackney, but he moved to White Hart Lane, not far from where my school was. So all these people that came integral to me. It's because we were all from the same area. A lot of artists might say, they're from South London, but in that small little area from Holloway, like Freshkey was in Finsbury Park, but Family Quest in Holloway Road, Cali area, and Cool Cash was in White Hart Lane. So we were all inseparable. But what happened was even Soul to Soul, being North London, that sort of area based, Emix always spoke about Soul to Soul, but I had never met them, because if I wasn't, I was a bit funny. If I wasn't doing something, I generally didn't go to it, because I just wanted to be at home and just be working more and more. But at some stage, Family Quest, Ricky Reynolds did a jam after Spats on around 85 period on a Saturday afternoon to the early evening in Brixton Recreation Centre, and we'd go down there, and then Ricky Reynolds used to ask us to keep coming, and because we did that, in a weird way, I met Jazzy like that early, like because Jazzy was bringing the sound system. He was so he kind of was questioning us, like with the records, like Pleasure Boys, all records that we might be playing, like what's that? And then we kind of got talking, and he was teasing us like, oh, he's like, I remember helping him lift some boxes out, because he was like, oh, you guys are like, you're not used to this type of work, or because he saw us as one angle of the sound system thing. But so I kind of got to know him from there, and whenever I saw him, he was always cool. And then I did start going to parties that he did, but in a weird synchronicity, a guy called Andy Shaft, he was the doorman at African Centre. So I hadn't gone to African Centre. I went out religiously every night, but I never went to African Centre, because by the time African Centre was happening, the guy Andy Shaft, who was the doorman, he had met me through Keith Lawrence, who he was a big DJ. Kid Lawrence, Kid Lawrence, and funny enough, he was from Caledon area. So I think through Family Quest, I knew Keith Lawrence. Well, Keith Lawrence, Andy Shaft said he was looking for a DJ to take to Paris, and because he'd met some people like who began Radio Nova and Actual magazine, and they said they were looking for a hip hop DJ. Because a famous DJ called Dynasty, the pioneer scratch DJ in France, Dynasty, he no longer was going to do this night, and they wanted somebody from the UK. So Keith Lawrence said, yeah, you have to get Fingers to do it. Because by the time I started Spats, like the guy I told you about, Braxton, we were mix masters, he no longer wanted to, he kind of became a bit dismayed, because I think he kind of got a little bit bullied. It was a bit of reverse racism then. It was very like Black and Strong at that period, and he was a Greek Cypriot English parents, and he kind of and he was better than me. He would, because he had the equipment in his house, the turntables. He was like amazing at that time, but I think he kind of felt like he was getting a bit bullied. He never really told me about it, but one day he just told me he didn't want to do it anymore. So I carried on just as Fingers. I was no longer the mix masters at DJ Fingers. I just became DJ Fingers. But Andy and Andy Shaft, who was doing the door at African Centre, came with Keith Lawrence, and they introduced himself to me like outside of Spats and said, look, we want to bring you to France to do this I think it could have been a one-off thing, and I think I'm not sure if it was a one-off thing, but I can't remember why we were being brought. And it was beginning again, this club they called Cher Roger, and in Strasbourg, Saint Denis, like just not far from Châtelet-La Halle. And it was like a club called El Globo. Like they said, look, we want to bring you to do this thing. So I said to them, if I come to France, I have to come with MCs, because that's kind of what I like to do. So I brought Crazy Noddy, and I brought Cool Cash C, and it was from going to France and performing, and then Andy Shaft, who I'm not sure if he still was doing the door for Soul to Soul, he told Eddie Richards, because Eddie Richards was about to do an EP. He said, look, these guys, Mr. C and the other tracks on this EP were there, and he had told Eddie Richards about us. And Eddie Richards weren't 100% sure, but when we met him and showed him what we do, and we already had the demo, me and Noddy had the demo, and the demo had even been played by Westwood, and some people argued the demo was better than what we had recorded, but the compromise was we made it the way it had to be made, because I was going into Eddie Richards' studio, so it was kind of made a bit not as raw as the original. But that's how I met Eddie, and then things took off for Eddie, and then
Eddie became quite big in house, didn't he?
Yeah, Eddie. As soon as we recorded that tune, things were starting to happen. And that's around the time I can remember, like that fire, King's Cross fire. We were even going to meet Eddie in the recording in the offices they had near Barbican, and the fire stopped us from going into the train at King's Cross. So it was kind of like a weird period. But at that time, Eddie had already done that. The kind of go-go record. That was his first release, wasn't it? I can't remember the name of the record, but it was almost like a go-go percussionist. And I think maybe that the guy who made the song had passed away. Like Cheese was famous, DJ Cheese, one of the first DMC champions. He had famously cut that record up.
Okay.
But after we had met Eddie, I had met him. I used to always go to Milton Keynes. Eddie would let me come up. Maybe, sometimes I'd wait for him when he finishes playing at the WAG Club. I'd have to wait in the car because the bouncers wouldn't even let me into the club.
Yeah, because it's a very different era, isn't it, this time?
Yeah.
You mentioned about, the sort of inverted racism, but there was technically
like
that with
80,
WAG and all of the
as early as 80. That's 85. Yeah, it was definitely a more black thing. And there was a kind of a thing going on, but maybe it's because we were facing it as well. But not. I mean, maybe it's not as strong as the way I'm saying it. I don't know, but my friend experienced it himself personally.
Yeah, things were more tribal in general, anyway.
Yeah, and he was independent. Like the whole thing about even talking about Spats was like we were in our own independent world. There was other scenes, and we had this thing going on before it kind of went above the radar. Yeah.
I mean, and then there was really tribes,
definitely
music clans that you almost went into, and it went into a bit more. Today it's sort of a lot more fluid, but you can really see now in time. And of course, the racism was all really serious. So like Tories in power, Thatcher era, like just blatant racism going on in the Sun. I mean, there's still that today, but it was absolutely like disgusting language that was just a normal thing that you would see and read in
totally
papers and on TV. So it's a very different era that was, that time, I guess, isn't it? So yeah. So you got your first so there was a couple of releases, weren't there? So it was called Bad Records, wasn't it?
Yeah, Bad Records. Yeah.
There was a couple.
He was based in Milton Keynes. Yeah.
So you had a track on a sort of an EP. There was a various sites, and then you did a solo with Sindecut.
I think that's what I'm sure maybe that was what introduced Mr. C as well. That's kind of why I think Mr. Eddie was not really sure, because he's like, Mr. C's doing this thing. But, Keith, we had Keith, who was close friends with Eddie through, and Andy, that were like saying, no, these guys are serious. So Andy, I think Eddie, we'd done the EP, and Eddie was like, yeah, you guys should do an album. But kind of what it was kind of weird in a way. Like what happened was, like, Eddie done a song with Emix from Family Quest, like who Emix even used to always, be the sort of sing J for Soul to Soul as well in the parties. He made a song, how was it? How Can We Live Together? Or Eddie Richard had this sort of, after he did the Acid Man song, he made this other song, but I think around the time he did Acid Man, which was massive, he was just touring. He was just traveling all around the world, and it wasn't so easy for me to get into Milton Keynes because he was never around. So he said, "Look, Mr. C's told me about a guy called Ronton, and he's got a studio in Kentish Town, which still North London. It's pretty accessible from Tottenham Archway down, So as soon as we met Ronton, it was like Eddie was like, put us in there. He introduced us to Ron, and it was like, finally, I'm actually in the studio where I'm not paying to use the studio. And I never had gear. I didn't have gear at home. I only had turntables. So it was like Ron had like he had like an Atari set up with a few Akai samplers, and we kind of learned. Me and the other producer out Sindecut, Don't Ramp, we both just lived in the studio for that summer.
Is this after the first 2 singles that were out?
Yeah, because Eddie around 80, yeah, it's a weirdly funny time because it was 89, like maybe Bad Meaning Good came out 87, yeah, that was 88. 88. We done an EP, and then I was waiting to try and get in more regular into Eddie's studio. Yeah.
Do you know what? I think we need to pause there.
On past time. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. So it's all good. We're going to do part 2. So we're going to come back and we're going to talk about Bad Meaning Good, the classic British documentary.
Okay.
We'll talk about Sindecut on Virgin, and we'll move forward. But we'll do a little pause here.
Okay then.
We'll
yeah,
chat.
Sorry, I'll just waffle.
No, that's fine. That's all good. Okay, cool.
All right.
All right. Let me just.
All right then.